Birth by A.J. Cronin. Though it was nearly midnight when Andrew reached Brangoa, he found Joe Morgan waiting for him, walking up and down with short steps between the closed surgery and the entrance to the house. At the sight of him, the burly driller's face expressed relief. Yeah, doctor, I'm glad to see you. I've been back and forward here this last hour. The missus wants here, before time, too. Andrew, abruptly recalled from the contemplation of his own affairs, told Morgan to wait. He went into the house for his bag. Then together they set out for number 12 Blina Terrace. The night air was cool and deep with quiet mystery. Usually so perspective, Andrew now felt dull and listless. He had no premonition that this night call would prove unusual, still less that it would influence his whole future in Blinelly. The two men walked in silence until they reached the door of number 12. Then Joe drew up short. I will not come in, he said, and his voice showed signs of strain. But, man, I know you will do well for us. Inside, a narrow stair led up to a small bedroom, clean but poorly furnished, and lit only by an oil lamp. Here, Mrs. Morgan's mother, a tall, grey haired woman of nearly 70, and the stout, elderly midwife waited beside the patient, watching Andrew's expression as he moved about the room. Let me make you a cup of tea, Dr. Bash, said the former quickly after a few moments. Andrew smiled faintly. He saw that the old woman, wise in experience, realized that there must be a period of waiting. She was afraid he would leave the case, saying he would return later. Don't fret, mother. I will not run away. Down in the kitchen, he drank the tea which she gave him. Overwrought as he was, he knew he could not snatch even an hour's sleep if he went home. He knew, too, that the case here would demand all his attention. A queer lethargy of spirit came upon him. He decided to remain until everything was over. An hour later, he went upstairs again, noted the progress made, came down once more, sat by the kitchen fire. It was still, except for the rustle of a cinder in the grate and the slow tick tock of the wall clock. No, there was another sound, the beat of Morgan's footsteps as he paced in the street outside. The old woman opposite him sat in her black dress, quite motionless, her eyes strangely alive and wise, probing, never leaving his face. His thoughts were heavy, muddled. The episode he had witnessed at Cardiff station still obsessed him morbidly. He thought of Bramwell, foolishly devoted to a woman who deceived him sordidly, of Edward Page, bound to the shrewish Blodwen of Denny, living unhappily apart from his wife. His reason told him that all these marriages were dismal failures. It was a conclusion which, in his present state, made him wince. He wished to consider marriage as an idyllic state. Yes, he could not otherwise consider it with the image of Christine before him. Her eyes, shining towards him, admitted no other conclusion. It was the conflict between his level, doubting mind and his overflowing heart which left him resentful and confused. He let his chin sink upon his chair, stretched out his legs, stared broodingly into the fire. He remained like this so long, and his thoughts were so filled with Christine, that he stuttered when the old woman opposite suddenly addressed him. Her meditation had pursued a different course. Suzanne said not to give her the chloroform if it would harm the baby. She's awful set up on this child, Dr. Bash. Her old eyes warmed at a sudden thought. She added in a low tone, we all are, I fancy. He collected himself with an effort. It won't do any harm, the anesthetic, he said kindly. They will be all right. Here the nurse's voice was heard calling from the top landing. Andrew glanced at the clock, which now showed 3:30. He rose and went up to the bedroom. He perceived that he might now begin his work. An hour elapsed. It was a long, harsh struggle. Then, as the first streaks of dawn strayed past the broken edges of the blind, the child was born, lifeless. As he gazed at the still form, a shiver of horror passed over Andrew. After all that he had promised, his face, heated with his own exertions, chilled suddenly. He hesitated, torn between his desire to attempt to resuscitate the child and his obligation towards the mother, who was herself in a desperate state. The dilemma was so urgent he did not solve it consciously. Blindly, instinctively, he gave the child to the nurse and turned his attention to Susan Morgan, who now lay collapsed, almost pulseless, and not yet out of the ether, upon her side. His haste was so desperate, a frantic race against her ebbing strength. It took him only an instant to smash a glass ampule and inject the medicine. Then he flung down the hypodermic syringe and worked unsparingly to restore the flaccid woman. After a few minutes of feverish effort, her hurt strengthened. He saw that he might safely leave her. He swung round in his shirt sleeves, his hair sticking to his damp brow. Was the child? The midwife made a frightened gesture. She had placed it beneath the bed. In a flash, Andrew knelt down. Fishing amongst the sodden newspapers below the bed, he pulled out the child. A boy, perfectly formed. The limp, warm body was white, soft as tallow. The cord, hastily slashed, lay like a broken stem. The skin was of a lovely texture, smooth, tender. The head lolled on the thin neck. The limbs seemed boneless. Still kneeling, Andrew stared at the child with a haggard frown. The whiteness meant only one thing: asphyxia pallida. That means suffocation or unconscious condition caused by lack of oxygen and excess of carbon dioxide in blood, accompanied by paleness of skin, weak pulse, and loss of reflexes. And his mind, unnaturally tense, raced back to a case he once had seen in the Samaritan, to the treatment that had been used. Instantly, he was on his feet. Get me hot water and cold water, he threw out to the nurse. And basins too. Quick, quick. But, doctor, she faltered, her eyes on the pallid body of the child. Quick, he shouted. Snatching a blanket, he laid the child upon it and began the special method of respiration. The basins arrived, the ewer, the big iron kettle. Frantically, he splashed cold water into one basin, into the other, he mixed warm, as hot as his hand could bear. Then, like some crazy juggler, he hurried the child between the two, now plunging it into the icy, now into the steaming bath. 15 minutes passed. Sweat was now running into Andrew's eyes, blinding him. One of his sleeves hung down, dripping. His breath came pantingly, but no breath came from the lax body of the child. A desperate sense of defeat pressed on him, a raging hopelessness. He felt the midwife watching him in a stark consternation. While there, pressed back against the wall where she had all the time remained, her hand pressed to her throat, uttering no sound, her eyes burning upon him, was the old woman. He remembered her longing for a grandchild, as great as had been her daughter's longing for this child. All dashed away now, futile, beyond remedy. The floor was now a draggled mess. Stumbling over a sopping towel, Andrew almost dropped the child, which was now wet and slippery in his hand, like a strange white fish. For mercy's sake, doctor, whimpered the midwife. It's stillborn. Andrew did not heed her. Beaten, despairing, having labored in vain for half an hour, he still persisted in one last effort, rubbing the child with a rough towel, crushing and releasing the little chest with both his hands, trying to get breath into that limp body. And then, as by miracle, the pygmy chest which his hands enclosed gave a short convulsive heave. Another and another. Andrew turned giddy. The sense of life springing beneath his fingers after all, that unavailing striving, was so exquisite it almost made him faint. He redoubled his efforts feverishly. The child was gasping now, deeper and deeper. A bubble of mucus came from one tiny nostril, a joyful, iridescent bubble. The limbs were no longer boneless, the head no longer lay back spinelessly. The blanched skin was slowly turning pink. Then, exquisitely, came the child's cry. Dear Father in heaven, the nurse sobbed hysterically. It's come alive. Hugh handed her the child. He felt weak and dazed. About him, the room lay in a shuddering litter. Blankets, towels, basins, soiled instruments, the hypodermic syringe impaled by its point in the linoleum, the ewer knocked over, the kettle on its side in a puddle of water. Upon the huddled bed, the mother still dreamed her way quietly through the anesthetic. The old woman still stood against the wall, but her hands were together, her lips moved without sound. She was praying. Mechanically, Andrew wrung over his sleeve, pulled on his jacket. I'll fetch my bag later, nurse. He went downstairs, through the kitchen into the scullery. His lips were dry. At the scullery, he took a long drink of water. He reached for his hat and coat. Outside, he found Joe standing on the pavement with a tense, expectant face. All right, Joe, he said thickly. Both. All right. It was quite late, nearly 5 o'clock. A few miners were already in the streets, the first of the night shift moving out. As Andrew walked with them, spent and slow, his footfalls echoing with others under the morning sky, he kept thinking blindly, oblivious to all of the work he had done in Blenley. I have done something. Oh God, I have done something real at last. Question and answer. Who was Dr. Andrew? Where was he working? Dr. Andrew was a young graduate who had just passed from medical school. He was working as an assistant to Dr. Edward in the small Welsh mining town of Blenheim. Who was Joe Morgan? Why was he waiting for the doctor when he returned at midnight? Joe Morgan was a miner working as a driller whose wife required medical attention during delivery. She was going to deliver her first baby almost 20 years after marriage. Joe Morgan was waiting for the doctor to help him. Did the doctor accompany Joe Morgan? How do you assess the doctor here? Yes, the doctor, without any complaint, accompanied Joe Morgan. Though he was physically and mentally very tired, the doctor was thoroughly professional. For him, duty came first, and no personal problem could come in the way of attending his work. Dr. Andrew had no idea that this particular night would influence his future career in Blandley. How did it do so? When Dr. Andrew accompanied Joe Morgan at midnight, he had no idea that this particular night was going to affect his whole future career. The doctor did his best to save Susan Morgan, and he revived the child to give a fresh lease of life to the family. Dr. Andrew's efforts were really commendable and shaped his future. Who was the old lady? Why was she afraid? The old lady was Susan Morgan's mother, a tall, grey haired woman of nearly 70. She was wise in experience. She realized that there must be a period of waiting before the delivery. She was afraid that the doctor might leave the case, saying he would return later. Dr. Andrew was good enough to wait at Joe Morgan's house till everything was over. Why did he decide this? Dr. Andrew had reached Joe Morgan's home at midnight. He was distressed and upset. He knew that if he went back home, he would not be able to sleep even for an hour, though he needed much rest. Moreover, as the case was complicated and needed all his attention, he decided to remain there until everything was over. Why did Dr. Andrew say, "Don't fret, mother, I will not run away"? When Mrs. Susan Morgan's mother told Dr. Andrew that she would prepare tea for him, the doctor could sense the old woman's anxiety that he may go away, as there was still some time for delivery. Sensing her anxiety, the doctor uttered these words. Why was Dr. Andrew in a conflicting state of mind? Dr. Andrew loved his girlfriend Christine and thought of leading a peaceful life with her by marrying her, but he had been thinking of many unsuccessful marriages. People like Bramwell, Edward, Denny were all living unhappily due to problems in their marriages. So, he was in a very conflicting state of mind. Why was Dr. Andrew suddenly startled as the old woman addressed him? What were the old woman's thinking of when she spoke to Dr. Andrew? Dr. Andrew was absorbed in his thoughts about marriage and relationships. The old woman was much concerned about her daughter and the baby she was going to deliver. So, the old woman told Dr. Andrew that her daughter did not want chloroform if it would harm the baby. Due to the sudden disturbance in his thought, Dr. Andrew was startled. Why did Dr. Andrew shiver with horror? After a long, harsh struggle for nearly an hour, the baby was born. Unfortunately, it appeared lifeless. A shiver of horror passed over Dr. Andrew. He thought of all the promises that he had made to Mr. Joe Morgan and his family. So much had been expected of him, but he failed. The realization made him shiver with horror. Why was Dr. Andrew in a state of conflict when the child was born? Dr. Andrew was in a state of conflict as he was torn between two situations. The dilemma before him was whether to save the mother first or her child. The dilemma was so urgent that he could not solve it consciously. What did the elderly midwife think of the young doctor in the beginning? The midwife in the story remained doubtful about the young doctor's abilities and pessimistic about child's survival. Her act of keeping the child under the bed shows that she never believed that the doctor would be able to revive the child at any stage. Why did Dr. Andrew want to save the child? The child looked lifeless at birth. Dr. Andrew realized, due to his medical knowledge, that the child suffered from an abnormal medical condition which made it look dead, but there was a chance of it being revived. So he made frantic efforts to save the child. What efforts did Dr. Andrew make to save the lifeless looking boy at birth? When Dr. Andrew saw the lifeless looking boy, he realized that the boy's whiteness meant that he was suffering from asphyxia pallida, which required a particular method of revival. So he began a special method of respiration. In this regard, he alternatively plunged the child into a basin of icy water and very hot water repeatedly. Then, in one last desperate effort, he rubbed the boy, crushing and releasing his chest, trying to get breath into its limp body. Suddenly, the child's chest started going up and down. Some mucus came out of his nose, and finally, the boy gave a cry. What was the condition of the room after Dr. Andrew had saved both mother and child? The room was in a mess, full of soiled newspapers, towels, blankets, soiled instruments. The floor was full of mud, water, as the doctor had used two basins full of water. The hypodermic syringe was stuck in the linoleum on the floor. The jug was knocked over and the kettle was on its side. On the huddled bed, the mother was lying unconscious. How did the old woman feel when she heard the child crying? Dr. Andrew's frantic efforts succeeded in giving a new life to the child. The boy gasped and his color slowly turned pink. Then, finally, came the child's cry. The old woman was standing against the wall. She was praying silently. How did Dr. Andrew feel after saving the lives of Susan Morgan and her child? What was Dr. Andrew's reaction and why did he say so? Dr. Andrew made frantic efforts to save both mother and her baby. It was really a very tough job to concentrate on because he had to focus on two lives. So, when he got success in it, he uttered, I have done something. Oh God, I have done something real at last. He thanked God and felt a sense of relief. He spoke these words out of deep satisfaction on achieving something seemingly impossible. He had been able to apply his medical knowledge and skill to revive a newborn. He felt that God had used him as a medium. There lies a great difference between textbook medicine and the world of a practicing physician. For a long time, we have been hearing that there is a lot of difference between theory and practice. This is true. Theoretical information gathered from books does not always provide solution for real situations. The medical textbook provides information about the treatment of various diseases, but at times doctor faces the dilemma which cannot be solved by theory. In this chapter, also, we notice that Dr. Andrew undergoes the same experience. When the mother and son both needed his attention, he had to make a decision about who to take care of first. In this decision making, no medical textbook could have helped him. In this case, Dr. Andrew acted instinctively. He first saved the mother and then the child. He treated the mother with the traditional treatment and the child with a mixture of traditional and intuitive treatment. The net result was that both survived and his efforts were successful. If Dr. Andrew had gone by the textbook, he might have not been able to save the mother or the child. According to the textbook, the child was born lifeless, but Dr. Andrew was successful in reviving it. Hence, we see that there lies a great difference between textbook medicine and the world of practicing physician. It is a fact that books provide us with in depth information about a particular topic, but practically, observation provides a platform to test that knowledge. It has been observed many times that a person gains insight into that bookish knowledge through practice and observation. Dr. Andrew used his knowledge as well as his observation to revive the stillborn child. For doctors, the duty towards the patient is foremost, irrespective of their own personal affairs. There is a saying that after God, it is only a doctor who can save the life of someone. A patient comes to a doctor with the hope that he would cure his/her illness. But we should not forget that a doctor himself is a human being. Troubles, miseries are part of his life also. He can also feel distressed, depressed. In spite of all these, a doctor has to treat his duty as the foremost priority. In this chapter, also, we notice that Dr. Andrew, who was really upset before coming to Joe Morgan's house, decided to stay back because it was the need of the situation. He could barely see his own future, but was diligent enough to realize the need of the hour. Hence, we can say that even though being preoccupied with his thoughts, he did his best to succeed in what he was doing. Marriages. The author in this chapter gives some example of bad marriages and puts Dr. Andrew in a confused state of mind as he considered marriage as an ideal state and a peaceful abode. Actually, marriage succeeds only due to the efforts of both the partners. Where there is dishonesty, cheating, mistrust, authoritarian attitude, intolerant partner, etc., a marriage cannot survive. But in India, we see less failures of marriages due to the cultural and moral values. Here, people believe in the institution of marriage. Through patience, understanding, sympathy, both husband and wife try to continue their married life and do not go for divorce easily. There may be problems due to individual differences, but life partners try to sort them out and keep the relationship alive. No matter what your profession is, moral values always play an important role in making you a complete human being. Explain. Moral values play a crucial role in shaping a complete human being by providing a framework to distinguish between right and wrong, guiding decision making, fostering positive character traits like empathy, responsibility, integrity, ultimately enabling individuals to contribute meaningfully to society through ethical actions and positive relationships. Explanation with reference to the chapter Birth. यहाँ ऐसे सेगमेंट्स उठा के लिखने हैं जहाँ डॉक्टर एंड्रयू के कथन में या करनी में हमें मॉरलिटी के स्ट्रेन देखने को मिलते हैं. फर्स्ट इंस्टेंस है कि रात के 12 बजे भी जब जो मॉर्गन उसे बुलाने आता है वो उसे भगा नहीं देता है, वो उसके साथ चल पड़ता है। दूसरा इंस्टेंस है कि पेशेंट की मदर, ओल्ड लेडी, उन्हें डर लगता है कि कहीं डॉक्टर भाग ना जाए, तो वो उन्हें आश्वासन देता है कि नहीं, मैं भागने नहीं वाला, जब तक काम पूरा नहीं हो जाता मैं यही बैठूंगा। थर्ड इंस्टेंस है कि वो जी जान लगा के एक स्टिल बॉर्न लाइफलेस बच्चे पे, जहाँ सारी उम्मीद सबने छोड़ दी थी, पर वो कोशिश करता रहा। ही फॉट टायरलेसली टू रिससिटेट द इन्फेंट, bring him back to life.